as the introduction said, I'm Anna Jackson from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I was the original curator of the exhibition when it was on in London. And the word Maharaja means great king. And it really conjures up an image of a turban, bejeweled ruler, someone with enormous wealth and absolute power. It's a very sort of evocative and quite romantic image, if you like. But we realise that not many people know who the Maharajas really were. And that kind of image is a bit limited. It's a bit of a stereotype, if you like. So the exhibition is very much intent on sort of unpacking that stereotype and explaining to people who these kings of India were, why they were important to the social, political, and of course cultural history of the Indian subcontinent. And the exhibition starts in about 1700 and goes right the way through to independence in 1947. And it shows how the objects that the Maharajas commissioned and acquired very much reflected their changing status and power and identity over these years. So we start with this wonderful portrait, a very large portrait. Those of you who are familiar with Indian art are perhaps more used to seeing paintings on a smaller scale, which obviously we'll see in many parts of the exhibition, but we start with this very large painting on cloth, and it dates to the beginning of the 18th century, so right at the start of our period. And it's a ruler called Amar Singh, who ruled the kingdom of Mewar. His capital city is in Udaipur, so it's present-day Rajasthan. And it's really an idealized image of a perfect king, if you like, always shown in profile. And you can see we can tell a lot about his demeanor and about his dress from this portrait, but also something about what it means to be a king. You can see he's got this sort of nimbus around his head, a halo, which suggests something of his divine authority. He's got his wonderful jewelry here. We've got pearls, rubies and emeralds, suggesting his wealth and his status. You can see he's carrying this wonderful long sword, and he has a dagger in his sash, suggesting his abilities to be a martial leader, a leader of his people into battle if necessary. But in his hand he carries a flower, and it's just this idea of being somebody of a dual nature, a great warrior, but also a man who can appreciate beauty, a cultivated man. And in this first room here, that's what we explore. What does it mean to be a king in India? What kind of person did you have to be if you were an ideal king? A king had to exercise his Raj Dharma, if you like, his royal duties. He obviously had to create a kingdom for his subjects, to protect them, whether from enemies or from marauding animals. He had to adjudicate justice, and all that he would do in his royal assembly, in his durbar, his court. We see various rulers in their court. The first ruler here is in Hyderabad, and here we see him sitting on a textile throne underneath a canopy. He's got his courtiers around him, and he's being fanned by somebody holding a peacock feather fan. Similarly, this ruler here from Jodhpur, again sitting on a textile throne. His attendant is carrying a chowri. It's a sort of holder of yak hair, sometimes called a fly whisk, but not really something that has perhaps a lot of practical application. It's really a symbolic thing that the attendant would hold. He's smoking a hookah pipe here, and you can see he's in a very lush garden, like our ruler in Hyderabad. The kingdom, the throne wouldn't be a fixed object in one place. It would effectively be wherever the king was sitting. And here you can see he's holding court in this wonderful, lush garden. And here we can see the ruler. The ruler was supposed to be a man of charity. And here we have a ruler again of Mewar being weighed in gold. This is something that would happen perhaps on the ruler's birthday or another important occasion. This occasion is actually the king is celebrating the opening of a reservoir in his state of Mewar. So showing that he was able to do these big public projects, if you like, to help his people. It's still a very important reservoir in Udaipur, and he's been weighed in gold, and then the gold will be distributed to the poor of his kingdom. Obviously you'd like your Maharaja to be a weighty individual. The North American tour has tried to recreate something of the settings of the court that you see in some of these paintings. So here we have the textile agadi, and behind another textile. The richness of India's courts was very much expressed through the wonderful textiles. When you see architecture in India now, you have to try and imagine what it would have been like when it was all hung with these wonderful rich textiles. And this particular hanging at the back here, we know came from the royal court of Jaipur. And here are these two objects that I've mentioned before, the chowry, the yak-haired fly whisk, if you like, and this here, this is a mortrel, it's called, with the peacock feather fan. Peacocks, when they spread their feathers, they're supposed to be sort of symbolic of royalty. The eye of the peacock feather is about sort of protection of the king offering his protection to his people. And in the front here, you'll see some of the accoutrements of kingship, the hookah base on the mat there, a rosewater sprinkler here. The favoured guests would be sprinkled with this wonderful fragrant water. And the other accoutrements are to do with the preparation of pan. Pan is like a sort of digestive. It takes a little bit like aniseed. Various kinds of spices would be wrapped in a betel nut leaf. And the king would prepare. He would take the ingredients out of these little boxes and prepare them for his guests. So it's a bit about the king's largesse, feeding his guests. But he would always do this at the end of an audience, so you knew it was your time to go once you had your lunch. Here we have some of the other objects that would have been used in court or worn by the king. I mentioned with Amar Singh, our ruler, right at the very beginning, that he had his sword and his dagger with him. Here are these sort of ceremonial weapons that you'll see here. And further on, we have some wonderful jewels. It's very important for a king to be seen in his splendour when he was in his court. And these kind of jewels didn't just reflect something of his wealth, they reflected something of his status and identity. And it was part of this sort of notion of darshan, it was the auspicious act of seeing and being seen by a superior being, whether that being was a god or a king. So it's important for the king to appear in all his splendour. And this a turban jewel was very, very important. It's a bit like wearing a crown, perhaps, in the West. And this is a particularly spectacular example that I'm very pleased to say belongs to the V&A. You can see it has this fabulous sapphire in the middle, almost as big as my palm here, also with wonderful emeralds and rubies and diamonds. And along again, another set of jewels, this time from the British Museum's collection. You'll see a necklace, bracelets, a ring and a belt. These are things to be worn by men. Don't forget, these are male jewellery for the king. And this belt's particularly spectacular. I know when we first brought it into the V&A to be installed in our exhibition, our gems specialist who works in our conservation department, she said, those are awfully big jewels, Anna, I don't think they're diamonds. So she took them upstairs to look under a microscope. She said, oh, I think they're colourless sapphires. I was thinking, oh no, change the label and not a spectacular. She came back, she said, no, you're okay, they're diamonds. They're whopping big diamonds, but they've actually been, we think of diamonds in the West, we like to cut the jewels so that they have a maximum sparkle. But of course, that's not the kind of aesthetic, if you like, in India. They like to preserve the maximum size and quality of the stone itself. So usually very slightly faceted, or sometimes even just polished. But what you have here are the diamonds that are cut very shallowly. They're quite thin, if you like, diamonds. But they've got foil behind them, which adds to the making them reflect more and look like they have more depth. But still pretty spectacular. But it's interesting about these jewels, which, as I say, very much about public display, they also have a sort of private element to them. And you often find that on the reverse, they're beautifully enamelled. So the mirror here enables you to see the enamelling behind the belt. And one of the bracelets, they've displayed sort of upside down, if you like, to see the beautiful enamelling. So it's interesting that there's this public display and then there's this private aspect, which would be known only to the wearer and perhaps some of his intimates. And here we have a wonderful selection of jade objects. Now these objects would have been made at the Mughal courts, but were often given as gifts, particularly to the rulers in what is present-day Rajasthan, because many of the Rajput rulers were in alliance with the Mughal emperors. They served at their courts as important generals or administrators, so they'd be given gifts, particularly, and it was particularly jade that was admired. So I think I want to point out this wonderful flask here, possibly one of the most famous Indian objects in a Western collection. It's always known as the Clive flask, because in the end it became owned by Robert Clive, who was one of the British generals in India who did much to sort of exercise British control in Bengal. But its earlier history, it was at the court of Murshidabad, which was a court of a sort of a ruler put in power by the Mughal emperor. He was a Muslim governor, if you like, of Murshidabad. But very, very beautiful here, jade inlaid with rubies and emeralds, a very important piece. The king had an important religious role, whether he was a Hindu king, a Muslim king, or a Sikh, a very important religious role. Again, it showed that he was a good king and he supported religious institutions or gave charity to holy men. There was also, for the Hindu kings, it was very much, they were almost like intermediates, if you like, between the gods and the people. But they also were, of course, private worshippers. They worshipped the rulers themselves. And you can see very much in this picture, we've seen so far the kings in all their splendor, if you like, and that's the common image you'll see throughout the exhibition. But here you have a very different image of a king. This is Balwant Singh, who ruled the small hill kingdom of Jasrota, and he had a very wonderful relationship with his court painter, Nansuk, and he allowed Nansuk to paint him, if you like, in rather intimate, private moments, just as we see here, just praying himself to Shiva, and just wearing a very simple white costume, no jewellery, but you can see he's still got his attendants with the peacock feathers, so we still know he's the king. By contrast, rulers would also participate in important public festivals. This is the festival of Gangaur, in which Shiva and Parvati are taken ritually taken for ritual immersion in the river. And this is the ruler in Kota. And you can see here, this is a fabulous sort of verdant, rich painting. The king, everyone's sort of in pink, very sort of celebratory, and his wonderful robes. Look at the wonderful horse here. I always think the way that particularly the artists in Kota paint the horses is very fabulous, and it's all the horses covered in marigolds, and he's giving a garland to this woman here, and you see the atmosphere of the parrots in the trees. So wonderful. These paintings really require a lot of in-depth looking. Every time you look at them, you see something more wonderful. By contrast, this painting, also from Kota, is unfinished, so it gives us a bit of an idea about the techniques of Indian painting. You've just got the drawing and some colour here. And here's the king celebrating Holi. Holi is the Hindu festival of the spring, when everyone covers each other with coloured paint. Still takes place every spring. And again, this is something about the king being a bit more accessible. It's a time when court protocol was breached, when actually the people of the town were able to spray the king with the coloured paints as well as him firing at them. Look at Indian paintings, you see them as sort of generic pictures of kings or whatever. You have to remember these are individual portraits of particular people. And this is Ram Singh II. This is exactly the same person as we've just seen taking part in the Holi festival. This is him again. And we've talked a little bit about the fact that the king is this public figure, and nowhere really is the sacred and secular power of a king more extravagantly expressed than in a grand public procession. And again, this is about darshan, it's about seeing the people seeing him. And this is really a wonderful painting, again from the V&A's collection, which really sort of sums this up. So here's the king. He's sitting on a howdah, the kind of carriage that sits on top of an elephant, and we have a fabulous example behind us of the one that comes from the collection here at the Asian Art Museum. I'm sure you perhaps are much more familiar with this object than I am. The king would sit there at the front, he'd have the attendant behind with the fly whisk again, with the chowry, protected by the parasol, but it's often this idea, who's protecting whom? Is the king being protected by the sun, or is everyone being protected from the king's brilliance himself? And here you see again the king with his halo, here his fabulous jewels, his sword. And even the elephants, you can see, are also wearing wonderful jewellery and textiles. Here are all the other accoutrements of kingship, if you like. His attendants here carrying various maces, they're carrying swords wrapped up in textiles and so on. They've got musical instruments in front. Here are the people, here are the women who've come out on the balconies to watch their king. And he got, just in case he gets bored, he's got some entertainment here himself. You can see he's got a dancing girl. She's on a platform attached to the tusks of the first elephant. So wonderful. Every person seems to be slightly different, different images, different faces. It's a wonderful painter. So it's rather fabulous to be able to show the whole extent of the painting, which shows a procession in Mysore, so right in the south of India, the procession of Krishnaraja Wadia, the Maharaja of Mysore. And you'll see as you move along, you don't just see the people in the procession, but you see all the people who've come out again to see the procession. So you get the series of carriages. Some of them contain the noblemen of the court, but also some of them contain the actual deities. And right at the other end, the very head of the procession, you'll find the king himself on an elephant sitting on his howdah. But behind him, you'll see a figure that's even bigger than him. The most important person in the painting is usually the largest, so the king is usually the largest in the painting. But here you'll see it's actually a British person on horseback who appears to be larger than all the others. And this really reflects that at this period in the early 19th century that Mysore was really under the control of the East India Company. And we'll hear a lot more about them as we go through the exhibition. And on the screen here, you'll see some wonderful film, archive film that we've used throughout the exhibition. What you're seeing here is part of a procession of the Maharaja of Jaipur arriving in Jodhpur to take his second wife. And this film is actually the personal family films that belong to the present Maharaja of Jodhpur. And he's very kindly allowed us to use them in our exhibition. And you'll see here someone, you can actually see them waving the chari. I don't know if you've been to Jodhpur, but the fort in Jodhpur is on a very, very steep hill. So you can see the elephants just lumbering up to the very end here. And the second bit of film shows the Maharaja of Kapurthala, which is one of the Sikh states in the Punjab. And you'll see him again here, he is getting into his howdah. And you'll see in a minute everyone clambering up and the umbrella going up above him. And if you look at this, the Mahut, the person driving the elephant. Notice the implement he has in his hand. We'll have a look at one of those in a minute. There's his umbrella. There he goes. He was a great Francophile, the Maharaja of Kapurthala. And this bit I love, because it proves, they've stopped it. It proves it's not always so easy to get off an elephant. But the implement that you'll see that the Mahut had in his hand is an ankus. This is what you use to control your elephant. This is rather a grand ceremonial one. Again, inlaid with precious gems and enamel. Very beautiful. And here's the chari. We spoke about the chari with the yak hair. This is a chari holder. Again, very, very beautifully enameled with jewels. Both of these come from Jaipur. And while I was working on the exhibition, we learned how to dress an elephant. So there's just a wonderful video that we included. We hired an elephant in Udaipur. We were very much helped by the present Maharana of Udaipur, and he doesn't keep elephants anymore, so we had to hire an elephant. Her name was Ramu. She was a freelance elephant, if you like, and we hired her on a very, very hot day. I think I'm barely seen in this film because I spent most of the time sitting under the tree because it was so hot. And we sort of learned how to dress her, if you like. She was very, very patient. She was very patient. Of course, the king was also expected to be somebody with great military prowess, be able to lead his troops into battle to defend his kingdom if necessary. And this is a wonderful suit of armour which also comes from Mewar. And it's actually been in the Viennese collection since about 1902. And I'm not sure if it's ever been on display, but what this exhibition has allowed us to do is really to, if you like, re-examine our own collection and find some treasures that perhaps we may have not forgotten, but have languished in a drawer. And this suit of armour was in a very poor condition, and it's been very lovingly restored by our conservation department. And I think there is a film, I think, on their website where you can see the people restoring it. You can see it's still quite fragile. We haven't been able to put it on a mannequin. It's on a very special stand here. And it's got this wonderful sunburst. This is sort of the symbol of the rulers of Mewar who sort of claim their descent from the sun. And this whole technique here, you can see it's layers of hemp and silk sort of riveted together with these little, they're copper gilt, but gilt with gold, and little sort of pins that go all the way through. It's called the 1,000-headed technique, and it's very particular to that part of India. Fighting in war would be hunting. Hunting would be seen as a good preparation for war. But it also showed the king's ability to control the natural realm around him, if you like. This is one of my favourite paintings, again from Kota, which shows the king in the long grass. You can barely see him here. It's all about the long grass, but here he is. You can always spot him, of course, because of his nimbus, and because of the fabulous jewels he's wearing. And the artist has captured him at this moment where he actually shoots the lion. You can see the actual gun smoke coming out of his gun and the wound he's inflicted on the lion. So this is the king being particularly brave. He's not on top of an elephant or in a hide. He's actually facing up very close to the animal. And the painting beside him you actually see is a woman, a female ruler, Chan Bibi. She was a historical character, so this is a painting painted about 1750, but it's a posthumous portrait, if you like, and it shows that even female members of the royal families would actually learn martial skills. Very, very beautiful painting. But she was very famous for sort of leading her own troops into battle against the Mughal forces, as well as being a poet, a woman of many talents. Women in this exhibition, because as I've mentioned, these are all portraits of particular kings, but you don't get often portraits of women. This is a posthumous portrait of what she might have looked like. And it's really because in all royal courts, there would be a division between the male part of the palace and the female part of the palace, where only the ruler and the women were able to go. And no painter would be allowed into those quarters. It wasn't possible for a painter to paint a queen. It's not until the late 19th century, with the advent of photography and things, that you get sort of an image of what a queen might have looked like. Instead, you tend to get idealized pictures. Exhibition, quite small, very, very elegant, very simple painting of a woman flying a kite. And this kind of painting is called a nazar. It means to gaze, and it would be the kind of painting that you would give to the ruler perhaps on his birthday, obviously something for him to look at rather intimately. And it shows this one woman here flying a kite, and it's very much related to the romantic poetry of the period. It's about yearning for an absent lover. So the idea of the kite being your lover, but you're still attached by that very thin string to the person that you love. And around you, you'll see wonderful costume, sari here for a woman, and then behind a costume worn by men of the court, including a young man of the court. Now perhaps I need to highlight this particular costume to you, which is rather spectacular. Added particularly for the North American tour. It comes from Hyderabad, sort of in the south central India, and it would have been worn by a bride in about 1900, and it's only been worn the once, so this is why it's still in very, very good condition. And I suppose the most striking thing about it is this amazing stole, the dupatta, very, very long, made of very, very fine pink silk, but embroidered with this incredibly heavy gold and silver thread and sequins. And in fact, the bride, it's so heavy that the bride would have sat throughout the ceremony. But we tried to get the mannequin to sit, and it really didn't look very good, so we've had to have the mannequin standing. And it was a bit of an exercise for our fabulous conservation department, and there's a whole perspex element that's part of the mannequin that's holding the stole up, and underneath all these folds are wonderful sort of sausages of rolled cotton, just to make sure that when we return this wonderful costume to its owner, it's still in as good and much condition as when they lent it to us. And behind here we have wonderful jewellery as well. At the court, music, very, very important part of court life. You often see musicians in paintings. And in fact, the survival of classical music in India owes much to the support of royal families. This stringed instrument, for example, comes from Gwalior, where there's a very strong tradition even to this day of classical music. And you'll see this, often these musical instruments had a decorative form as well as a practical form, if you like. This rather wonderful one in the shape of a peacock with real peacock feathers. And another thing popular at court was the playing of games. This box here was made specifically for the ruler of Mysore, Krishnaraja Warrior. He was the person we saw in that very, very long scroll at the beginning, in the other room next door. He was obsessed with board games, and as well as playing ones that were already known, if you like, he invented new ones. And this wonderful box here folds out to various different boards, and in the drawers underneath he would have kept all the pieces. But a more common game at court was a game called Chopa, which I think is quite similar to Pachesi, which I think is played in North America. And there's a portrait here of another ruler from Mewar again, playing Chopa with his courtiers. So he's sitting in this very cool atmosphere of his palace. There's a fountain here and fish are playing, birds are singing. So you get a sense of what the atmosphere was like. And again, you can spot him very easily. He's the largest figure in the painting. He's got his halo around him, his jewelry. He's smoking a hookah. You can see the hookah pipe here is actually in the form of a woman. Now, Chopa is a betting game. And you can see in front of the players are piles of coins. The king is winning. I suspect the king always wins, don't you think? And you remember earlier on we saw that wonderful portrait of the king in private worship. And I mentioned that this was by the artist Nansuk, who's a very famous Indian artist. And these two works are also by him. This, as I said, the kingdom was very small, Jasrota, and in fact the king had lost much of his wealth and power when Nansuk was working for him. But he still tries to create this idea of majesty in his paintings. But this one's more unusual. We're not sure whether this is actually of Balwant Singh, but it's certainly by Nansuk. And rather than having the king as this large figure, the centre of it all, the king here is this tiny figure at a window watching the fireworks. It's kind of like the artist has brought him down to a human scale again. And he seems perhaps a remote, even lonely figure. So quite different in contrast to the other pictures we've seen. And actually it's the protagonists here who set off the fireworks in his honour that are really the focus of the painting. Okay. Dealing with in this exhibition is one of enormous political change in India. We start with the decline of the Mughal dynasty, and then later in the 19th century the rise of the power of the British. And I think one reason why we wanted to do this exhibition is we feel that the Maharajas, the indigenous kings of India, have been rather marginalised. The dominant histories that people always tell are the stories of the Mughals. Everyone knows about Shah Jahan and the Taj Mahal. They know about the British, but it's the bit in between sometimes gets lost. And traditionally people have looked at the 18th century as a period of chaos. It's almost too complicated that they don't want to deal with it. But what we want to show is that this is a period of really strong regional rulers, and these are the rulers that we're celebrating in our exhibition. In 1707, that's the last of the great Mughal emperors. Aurangzeb died, and after that the Mughals were the subsequent emperors really lacked that kind of authority and power. The dynasty was beset by internal strife, and the end really came, well, the end, but a major blow came in 1739 when the Iranian ruler Nadir Shah invaded Delhi and sacked the royal treasury. And after that, although the emperors continued in name, they had very, very little real power. And into this sort of political vacuum came all these other powers rising up, if you like, to take the political place of the Mughals. And what you also saw at this time is the rise of the English East India Company. The East India Company, which had been founded in 1600, it was a trading company. It came to India to make money, effectively, and it operated around the edges of the Mughal Empire. They were tolerated by the Mughal emperors, if you like, because they brought silver to India to trade. And I think the British were very worried with the collapse of the Mughal power. They felt that they wouldn't, perhaps, they wouldn't be able to trade. But of course, what they discovered was that they could use this situation also to their advantage. So they almost became like another political power, fighting all these different groups, getting them to fight against one another. And what you see is the shift of the East India Company from a trading power into an important political and military power in India. And this next section of the exhibition, which is called Shifting Power, kind of tells the story through particular rulers. But we start with a look at the Mughals and who the Mughals were and their decline of power. And this painting comes from the Viennese collection, and it shows the Rajput ruler from Mewar, Amar Singh, making a submission, if you like, to the Mughals. This is Prince Khurram, the person who would become Shah Jahan. And the Mewar Rajputs had held out until the end, whereas many of the Rajput rulers, as I mentioned, became allies of the Mughals. the Mewar kings very famously fought on. They did not kowtow to the Mughals until they were really forced to right at the bitter end, and they're very proud, if you like, of that heritage. But you see some of the other rulers, like the ruler of Amber, who did serve the Mughals. This wonderful Mughal portrait of him, surrounded, if you like, by the elements that show his importance and power: jewellery, musicians, people of military rank, and so on. Whereas by the time that this painting was painted, although it looks very, very splendid, it's actually a period when Mughal power was really in decline. This is Muhammad Shah II, the person who had been forced to give up so many of his treasures to Nadir Shah. And he's passing a turban ornament. I mentioned how important these jewels were. They really are a significant, symbolic of one's power and identity. And he's passing a turban ornament to the ruler of Kissingar. So, if you like, a reflection of the fact that he recognises this person's authority. And again, it's a picture of great splendour, but it rather belies the actual political situation at the time. And by the time that we get to this ruler, so this is about 1740, this is about 1790, Shah Alam II, he's riding back to Delhi in this wonderful procession. Here he is, here. He's riding back to Delhi, and this is a time when the emperors really had very little power. Their power was really just confined to the area of Delhi. And he was only there because he was being protected by the Marathas, particularly by the Scindia family, whose power base was in Gwalior. Now, the Marathas are a very interesting power in the 18th century because they really were the most successful successors of the Mughals. And in the 18th century, it was the Marathas who ruled India. And you'll see from the maps that we have throughout this section show where the areas are that we're talking about. And if you look at this sort of the whitish area here, you can see the Maratha power extended virtually over the whole of India. The Maratha power was established in the late 1600s by this person, Shivaji. Now, if any of you have been to Mumbai, he came from the area near Mumbai, you'll know that absolutely everything is named after him. He's their great sort of nationalist hero, and he held out against Aurangzeb. In fact, Aurangzeb, he was the great thorn in Aurangzeb's side, if you like, and this wonderful imperial firman here is by the Emperor Aurangzeb. He's just telling everyone, for God's sake, go out and kill this man, because he's causing me so many troubles, but he never kind of got the upper hand. And Shivaji was very clever. He had this wonderful set of sort of generals, but rather than taking all the power for himself, it wasn't like the Mughals where they had this very central authority. The actual generals were allowed to have power and to take the lands that they conquered. And perhaps one of the least spectacular objects in the whole exhibition, but one of the most important, if you like, is this little tiger claw here. This is reputed to have belonged to Shivaji himself. And he was in negotiations with a general from Bijapur, his enemy, and they both had to meet in a tent. They were discussing a truce, but they both had concealed weapons. And the ruler from Bijapur apparently produced a dagger or something, but Shivaji was ready, and he had that tiger claw. You put it on your hand so the claws are in here. He had it concealed on his hand, and apparently he disemboweled his enemy. So very, very famous story. So young boys, I find, really like this. Yeah. Now, I mentioned this, that the Maratha power was almost like a confederacy of states, but the nominal ruler, if you like, the nominal head of the confederacy was what's known as the Peshwa. Perhaps you might translate that as Prime Minister, in Pune, which is quite near present Mumbai. And here is this wonderful Peshwa. This is a painting from the 1790s, and of course what instantly strikes you is that all the paintings we've looked at so far have been by Indian artists in an Indian style. And this is by a Scottish artist called James Wales, who was invited to the court at Pune by a member of the East India Company who was there, Charles Mannett. And this is the time when the East India Company had a rather uneasy alliance with the Marathas. And the ruler had his portrait painted. And what it also shows is the shift of sort of patronage that you see in this period, that someone wants to have their portrait painted in a very, very different way. Every portrait we've seen so far, the rulers has always been in profile. And here you see the ruler sort of looking at us. And look at these fabulous jewels. I wonder what's happened to those. Sadly, we don't know. Now, this was actually not a strong ruler. By this stage, Maratha power was starting to crumble a little bit. And it was actually his minister here who was the power behind the throne. And 3 years after this painting was painted, the Peshwa died in rather mysterious circumstances. Was it suicide? Was it murder? No one really knows. And after that, the different Maratha powers started to break up slightly, with each of the individual sort of family heads, if you like, asserting authority in their particular kingdoms. And the most important ones were the Scindia family in Gwalior, the Gakwad family in Baroda, and the Holkar family in Indore. And the Holkars actually held out right to the bitter end. They were the last to fall to British power. The British didn't usurp the kings, they just forced these kings to have alliances with them and to recognise their power. And the last great battle in the Anglo-Maratha battles took place in 1817, and the young Maharaja Holkar of Indore lost his sword on the battlefield, and this is his very sword. So some of these objects actually represent really this shift of power, the changes. And none more so than the rather interesting objects beside you there in the case. These are standards, so we're nipping a bit about in history at the moment, and they really show the shift of power in Delhi at about the same time, a year later, in 1803, slightly earlier. I mentioned that when Shah Alam came back to Delhi, he was in exile for a while, he was protected by the Marathas, he was protected by the Scindia family, who kind of controlled Delhi at that point. He was really only there with their protection. But the power base shifted again, and the Mughal Emperor, I think, could see that the British were the ones who were going to have the upper hand. So the British defeated the Scindia family and threw them out of Delhi, and they started to take control of Delhi. And the Emperor gave the British General Lake, this set of Mughal standards in recognition of the power. And this one here is actually inscribed, which tells the story. So again, it really shows the shifting of power that's happening in this very complex period of Indian history. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Rajputs a lot. We've talked about Mewar and Udaipur and Jodhpur and so on. And the Rajputs predate the Mughals. They had power in India long before the Mughals got there. But as the Mughals again started to lose their power, lose their authority, the Rajputs asserted their independence again, if you like. But just at this point, they were beset by the Marathas attacking them, by the Sikhs attacking them, and so on. So the canny British, yet again, came along and said, okay, how about we'll protect your borders, we'll help you stay in power if you accept our power, accept that we have supremacy in India. And they also had to give them some money, like a tribute, and they also had to accept British agents, if you like, a British resident of the East India Company, staying in the court. And this person in procession here is believed to be James Todd, who was the British resident at the beginning of the 19th century, and he was stationed primarily in Udaipur. And you see him in procession, but he's not surrounded by the sort of regalia of kingship, but only of administration. He's not a king, he's just a sort of administrator, if you like. But in fact, James Todd had a really kind of sensitive feeling for the Rajputs. He rather fell in love with the place that he was staying. And when he got back to Britain, he wrote famously about the annals of Rajasthan, and a lot of that is about how we understand Rajasthan today, still comes from his book. And when the treaty was first signed between the Mewar rulers and the British, the ruler of the period, Bhim Singh, gave a number of gifts to the East India Company, to the Governor-General Lord Amherst, and those gifts are gifts that symbolise rule, symbolise kingship, the umbrella again, and the shield. So some of the kind of objects of kingship that we've already seen in the exhibition. So these are the actual gifts that were given by Bhim Singh to Lord Amherst in 1818 and were given to the V&A by the present Lord Amherst. Now, the British found the Rajputs quite easy to negotiate, but there was a very, very different story in the south of India, when they came up against Britain's greatest foe, Tipu Sultan. Sorry. So here a map again. So we've been concentrating our story so far a lot in Delhi and the north and Rajasthan, but here we're down in the south again. And Mysore had traditionally been ruled by the Wodiyar family. We've come across them already. But Tipu Sultan's father was a general who served the Hindu kings, but they were very, very weak, and Hyder Ali sort of took over, and eventually in 1782, Tipu Sultan, his son, took the throne. And he was a Muslim ruler, and he saw it his great duty to drive the British out of India. and he took on the tiger as his personal emblem, if you like. So everything in his palace was covered in sort of tiger stripes and things. And we can see when kings often ride out, they don't always go on top of an elephant. Sometimes they're carried in a palanquin that is on poles. And you can see these pole ends are in the shape of tigers' heads. And even on these barrels of these flintlock guns, you can see there's the head of the lock is a tiger, and there are tiger stripes decorating it, and so on. And this kind of technology was brought to Tipu Sultan's court by the French. He employed French mercenaries, and of course the French were Britain's great enemies, in Europe. So he was definitely sort of doing everything he could really to rouse the British. And the British actually fought 4 wars against him. Only with the help of the Nizam in Hyderabad and the Marathas were they able to finally defeat him in 1799. And in British sort of history, he's always been seen as this tyrant, if you like. And it's only been in recent years that we've really reassessed him as a very capable, very able ruler that he was. But just as Tipu Sultan was meeting his sad end, if you like, in the south, right in the north, in the Punjab, another ruler was asserting his authority. Sorry, can I just... And that person was Ranjit Singh. He was a Sikh ruler, and he became the head of his Sikh clan when he was only 12 years old. He'd been affected by polio as a child, so he was almost what you might think of slightly crippled, a small man, perhaps didn't look like a ruler at all in our ideas, but was probably one of the greatest leaders in the early 19th century. A great military general, a great strategist. He managed to negotiate with the Marathas, with the hill tribes, with the Afghans, and even with the British to keep his power base around the city of Lahore. And with the British, he agreed that he would never go south of the Sutlej River. He would only ever expand northwards. And this wonderful picture here, this is a posthumous portrait of Ranjit Singh sitting in his court, surrounded by his family and his courtiers. And he's sitting on his famous golden throne, which of course we have here, one of the great treasures of the V&A, of Ranjit Singh's throne. And it really shows, if you like, the diversity of Ranjit Singh's court, because here is an object that is, you can see it's a raised throne. It's not like the textiles throne we saw earlier. It's a sort of Mughal, Muslim kind of prototype of sitting on a raised throne. It's in the shape of 2 lotus leaves, which is a Hindu symbol of purity. It was made by an Islamic craftsman at Ranjit Singh's court, and of course he was a Sikh ruler. Because what's most spectacular about it is that it's gold. I think we're all used to seeing lovely gold jewellery, perhaps some small gold boxes, but it's unusual to see a big thing that's gold, because normally large things are silver that has been gilt. And of course the wonderful thing about this is that it's gold. And it's not solid gold, I hasten to add, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to lift it. But it's on a wooden core with these wonderful embossed gold sheets. And why did it end up in the V&A? Well, when Ranjit Singh died in 1839, there was a real bitter power struggle broke out for control of the Punjab, and his son Sher Singh eventually took the throne, but he was not a popular man. He met a rather unpleasant end about 2 years later, and Ranjit Singh's youngest son, Dulip Singh, the young boy here with the red turban, he was put on the throne. But he really couldn't control the generals, and they rather foolishly tried to expand beyond the Sutlej River, and that was the only excuse that the British needed. They came in and they annexed the Punjab. And the throne was taken off by the East India Company to the East India Company Museum in London, and eventually those collections were absorbed into the Victoria and Albert Museum. And Dulip Singh, of course, came to Britain and became quite a favourite of Queen Victoria. And of course, he gave her his father's jewels, including the most famous diamond in the world, the Koh-i-Noor. The Koh-i-Noor is presently part of the crown jewels, so sadly wasn't able to borrow it to bring it to San Francisco. Now, what you've heard so far is very much about how countering the British really just caused conflict in India, but it also caused interesting changes in patronage. And you see that actually particularly in the courts that are Muslim courts, not with Tipu, but where the Mughal emperor had put his own sort of governors in charge, if you like, what are sometimes known as the sub-Mughal states. these were the ones that, as Mughal, the central authority in Delhi started to wane, they started to assume their own authority again. And what you see, this person here is the Nawab. That the word Nawab is, the word Maharaja is only for Hindu kings, so Nawabs for Muslim rulers. The Nawab of Arcot, again having his portrait painting by a Western artist called Tilly Kettle, wearing the very famous Arcot diamonds here. And he was one of the first rulers in India to actually commission British porcelain manufacturers to make him porcelain to eat off. Another ruler who did this was Gada Haidar of Avid. He commissioned these spode plates here, and he also had a Scottish artist, very successful in India, Scottish artist called Robert Home, who made things for him, designed things for him, including this throne chair. So when you look at it, to all its intents and purposes, it looks European, it's kind of French. But actually you see the twin fish in the back are the symbols of Avid. The twin fish and the punch dagger are the symbols of Avid. And the rulers of Avid created these wonderful hybrid European-style buildings, which you see in this painting here, which is showing a festival taking place in about 1850. But by this stage, really, the rulers of Avid were really under the thumb of the British. They had very little control of themselves. And in 1856, the last ruler of Avid was ousted by the British on the grounds of misrule, very, very unfairly. And the British took over the capital of Avid, Lucknow. But this was the extent of British territories, the extent of annexation. And you can imagine that a lot of these, the British extending its power in this way, this real shift, if you like, from being just a trading body into being sort of a colonial power, caused a lot of unrest in India. And there were uprisings against the British, but of course the big one came in 1857, and a lot of the fighting took place in Lucknow. So sadly, a lot of these wonderful European-style buildings were destroyed. Now, the opponents of the company fought very, very hard in 1857, and they took on board as their sort of nominal leader the Mughal emperor. And he was 81 years old by this stage, and Badia Shah, and he was a poet, and he didn't really, if you want the job of taking on being the opponent to the company, but he was seen as the figurehead. But although, as I say, the company fought very bravely, and the rulers, the individual rulers of India, some of them sided with the British and some of them sided against them, but it was quite easy for the British in a way to reassert control in the year later in 1858. And one of the great victims, if you like, of the mutiny, as it's often called, or the First War of Independence, as people in India prefer to call it, was the Mughal Empire. He was the last Mughal emperor. He was forced to watch his children being executed, and then he was exiled to Burma, where he died a broken man a few years later, and that was the end of the great Mughal dynasty. But it was also the end, interestingly, of the East India Company. Up until this point, they had continued to operate as an independent trading company, but the British government, if you like, could see that really this power was getting out of hand. So that was the end of the East India Company power in India. And in fact, from that point on, the British Crown, if you like, took over authority in India. But it's important to remember that they didn't control all of India. They only controlled the bit that had already been annexed by the company. So just over half of India was British India, if you like, and the rest was still ruled by the individual kings, the Maharajas or the Nawabs. So they had to sort of adjust. As they'd adjusted to the Mughals before them, they then had to adjust to the British. What was quite interesting about the British rule in India, if you like, the most important person in India was the Viceroy, who was like the Queen's representative in India, or the King's representative in India. And there were three very famous durbars in India. One in 1877, at which Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India. One in 1902, which recognised the accession of Edward VII. And one in 1911, which recognised the accession of George V. And this painting commemorates the 1902 event. And it was organised by Lord Curzon, the Viceroy, and he's the person on the front elephant. So what's interesting is that the British aren't trying to do something different. They're not trying to be British, if you like, in India. They're just taking on the accoutrements of kingship. So we saw the wonderful ram kota at the beginning in procession on an elephant underneath an umbrella being found by people with chariot. And this is what's happening here. The British are taking on those accoutrements of kingship, making themselves understood in an Indian context. Now, Curzon spent an absolute fortune on this big event that took place in 1902, and the king didn't even come. So the person on the lead elephant is Curzon and his wife. This is the Duke of Connaught, who was the king's brother, who represented the royal family, and behind you see all the rulers of India on their elephants. Now, the British, as you probably know, love to categorise people and make them into hierarchies, and they did this in India as well by introducing what they know as gun salutes. So they identified the most important kingdoms, the ones that were the largest or were the richest or had the most power, and they had 21 gun salutes, and then it went down 19, 17, so on to 13, and then there were some kingdoms which didn't have any guns at all. So what you see are the rulers that you can see right at the very beginning are the ones that were considered the most important. So you have the Nizam of Hyderabad, the ruler of Mysore, the ruler of Kashmir, Mysore, Gwalior, and Baroda, the ones that were considered the most important kingdoms. Now, the ruler of Baroda is an interesting person, Sajirao Gaekwad, because he became rather disillusioned with the British at the time of the Great Famine. He thought the British just made matters worse rather than better. And he was a very, very able ruler, but in the 1911 Durbar, I don't know if you can watch the film, he rather famously refused to kowtow to George V. This was the only time a British king actually came to India for the Durbar. And here he is, he turns his back on the king as he walks away. Caused an absolute outrage in Britain. It was considered to be, treasonable, but they couldn't get rid of this king because actually he was a very, very able ruler. So if you come back through, do watch this film. It's rather fabulous, preserved in the British Film Institute. And it really shows the great scale of these amazing Durbars that took place. This one in 1911. Now, photography, we've seen wonderful paintings as we've walked along the exhibition. Photography became very, very popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, and many Indian rulers had their portraits taken in this new medium, and some even took up the art of photography themselves. And what these paired pictures do here is really show something of the shifts that are taking place at this time, the contrasts in people's power and identity and how they identify themselves. So these are two portraits of the same person, Pratap Singh of Orcha, and you can see here he is in a pose we've seen very commonly in the paintings at the beginning, sitting on his gadi with his sword and his shield being fanned by the chowry and the morchal. And here he is, this is dating to about 1885, I think, and this one is 1903. You can see him in what became a very common pose, if you like. He's wearing the Order of the Indian Empire. Again, the British confer orders of merit on the Indian kings in a studio setting. And here we have the man who turned his back on the king, Sajirao Gaekwad, and here he is in all his splendour. And of course, this is a period, if you like, when the idea of being a Maharaja became rather stereotyped, this idea of this turbaned ruler and so on. So here he is in all his splendour. This is how he should have appeared at the Delhi Durbar, but he didn't. He dressed down. But at the same time as being this sort of stereotypical ruler that really reflected this idea of India being the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, the rulers were also supposed to be like English gentlemen. So here is exactly the same person outside the House of Commons, wearing a sort of an English morning suit. And he's with his wife here, Chumnabai, and they're really a very powerful couple. Probably one of the most able rulers in the late 19th, early 20th century. He introduced free compulsory education. He sent out libraries to the villages in Baroda. He started wonderful schools. He started a wonderful college and a wonderful art college in Baroda, which is still one of the most important state art colleges in India. And with his wife's support, he outlawed polygamy. he encouraged widows to remarry. And she actually wrote a book which was called The Position of Women in India, in which she compared being a woman in India with being a woman in the West. It's a very, very interesting couple. And as you probably know, our guest of honour here at the gala this evening is Maharaja Gaekwad, who is married to one of the princes of the present Baroda royal family. Now, some rulers, including those from Mewar, we talked about how the rulers of Mewar didn't sort of allow the Mughals to take control over their lands at all, and they also very famously weren't very impressed by the British either, and the ruler refused to sort of become British, if you like. But many rulers at this point started taking on the trappings of a European sort of lifestyle, building palaces in a European style, and also starting to dress in a European style, and having their portraits painted again in oils. We've seen that throughout the exhibition. But this is a painting not by a British or Scottish artist, this is by an Indian artist who's learnt the kind of methods of painting in oils on canvas to notions of Western realism. And this is the Nawab of Bawalapur in present-day Pakistan. And you can see he's wearing this wonderful braided jacket. It looks very Indian in some ways, very sumptuous fabric, but you can see the braids and the fact that they've got inset sleeves and things is very European. And this coat here was owned by this gentleman. You can see it's quite similar in style. He was also a great patron of a firm from Birmingham, that's Birmingham in the Midlands, not Birmingham, Alabama, who made crystal. They were called F.C. Osler, and they made crystal furniture. And this was incredibly popular in the great new palaces that were being built by rulers such as the Nawab of Bawalapur. And we have two wonderful sort of occasional tables, again owned by the same person as in the portrait. Now, as the king started to build these palaces, they generally turned to agents. So Osler, for example, had agents all over India who would come to the palaces, take the order, make sure everything was shipped over from Britain and built in the palaces. But as the 20th century went on, Maharajas started to travel more and more to Europe and started to become very much a part of lifestyle in Europe. But they also served the British in other ways. We've talked about the ruler from Baroda and how able he was. Kapurthala, the person you saw getting on the elephant in the film at the very beginning, he was another very able ruler. He was very much a Francophile, loved to go to Paris and so on. But he again was one of these people who sort of brought education. He also tried to introduce limited suffrage voting. But although the British wanted the Indian rulers to be impressed by the British, they certainly didn't want them to introduce anything as radical as democracy, so he wasn't allowed to do that. But other rulers served the British, like this ruler here, Ganga Singh of Bikaner, again, very capable ruler. He brought irrigation. I mentioned the Sutlej River in the story of Ranjit Singh. He actually managed to negotiate the waters coming from the Sutlej River to the great canal, the Ganga Canal, it's now just known as the Rajasthan Canal, which brought water to his desert state of Bikaner. He started the Bikaner Camel Corps, who still patrol the Pakistan-India border. And he also was the first Indian to become a general in the British Army, and he represented the Indian princes at the Treaty of Versailles. But as these rulers started to travel more and more to Britain, they became patrons of British firms. And they'd often have quite a sort of creative dialogue with these firms. And probably the most famous really is Cartier. And you see a wonderful collection of small Cartier objects in this case. And also these watches here, not by Cartier, but by Jaeger-LeCoultre. And they're reverso watches, they're known as. And they were made specifically for wearing on the polo fields of India. And the actual clock mechanism flicks over to protect the clock, so it kind of flicks like this so that you protect the face of the watch as you're playing polo. And these wonderful drawings here are show the interior of the Umad Bhavan. This was the last great palace to be built in India in Jodhpur by Umad Singh of Mawar, of Jodhpur. And the palace is vast. It was the largest private residence when it was created. You can go and stay there yourselves now if you fancy it. It's now a luxury hotel, although the present Maharaja Jodhpur still lives in one wing of it, and he's very kindly lent these wonderful drawings which show some of the interiors, very deco in style. And these interiors all remain here. The Maharani's bathroom, I think, is my favourite. I've never stayed in this room, I have to say. I believe it's Madonna's favourite, I'm told, by the concierge. But jewellery, I think, is very much at the heart of what we think of the Maharaja's wearing. And this is Bhupendra Singh of Patiala. He was a Sikh ruler. He was very good friends with our friend in Kapurthala. They were close neighbours and great friends. They used to fight to have the best jewellery. And in 1925, Bhupendra Singh turned up in Paris with great crates of gems. And this is what the Maharajas tended to do. They'd bring the jewels from their own treasury and ask European jewellers to remake them for them, reset them for them in the new styles. And Bhupendra Singh is very famous for having many, many wives. I believe he had about 50. So most of his jewellery was made for his wives, including this fabulous ruby and pearl necklace here, very usual having colour photograph. And Cartier have wonderful archives, and they've preserved everything about this commission. It was the largest commission by a single person that they've ever had. And they have wonderful records of every gem that he gave them, everything they did with them. And they, as I say, most of the jewellery was for his many wives, but he created for himself 2 magnificent ceremonial necklaces. This is one of them, which is more Indian in style because it has these flat cut, just polished stones. But we don't know what's happened to any of this jewellery at all. But of course, one piece very famously survives. And we're very lucky to have it here in San Francisco, the great Patiala necklace. It contains 2,930 diamonds. It weighs about, I don't know, 5 kilos or something. I can't remember. It's very, very heavy. I have picked it up. It's very, very heavy. And you can see how totally spectacular it is. But this has a rather interesting story to it. As I mentioned, we don't know what's happened to many of these jewels after independence. And Eric Nussbaum, who was the head of the Cartier collection, was in London in the late 90s. And he found in a store, in a dealer's storeroom, this completely dilapidated necklace. Because, of course, the Cartier archives are so particular, he knew instantly what he was looking at. So he bought back the necklace for Cartier. And because Cartier have all their old records, they know how they used to work. It took 3 years for the craftsmen of Cartier to recreate this necklace, as long as it had taken them to make it in the first place. But the great gems in the middle and the rubies were missing. Obviously, you know, jewellery is often deconstructed and reconstructed. It's not uncommon, but I imagine that the individual gems were sold off at some point by the Patiala family. So the Cartier tried to reproduce these gems. Obviously, you can't find diamonds that big anywhere. So they tried with topaz and with sapphire. None of them were able to have that wonderful gleam that diamonds have. So in fact, the central things and the rubies are cubic zirconia. They're synthetic diamonds. But I think you can see it's still a pretty spectacular object. And we have this wonderful film here. We're just coming to the end of it here, actually. This is Bhupendra Singh's son, Yadavendra Singh, wearing the wonderful necklace. I do urge you to come and sit and watch the film all the way through. Wonderful to have colour film. It's one of the only colour films. And this was a film that was taken by an American, I'm pleased to hear, called Lawrence Copley Thor, who went around India photographing it. And in fact, there it is. It has wonderful commentary, which we don't have, which is terribly English, in fact, about how marvellous and fabulous it all is. And, but you can see him here. He was the last ruler of Patiala. And he's also wearing at his belt this fabulous, enormous emerald, which you'll be pleased to hear is in this case. Again, a fabulous jewel in itself that has been mounted by Cartier again with these diamonds. And we've borrowed this object from the Islamic Art Museum in Qatar, and the director there said, "Oh, do you want us to unmount it and take those hideous diamonds off?" I went, no. That's my story, obviously, because the emerald itself is what's so totally amazing. I said, no, we're having it because it was mounted by Cartier. And we also like to tell our women's story as much as we can. And we have this wonderful section here which is devoted to the women of the period. It wasn't just the Maharajas who came to Europe, of course, it was their wives and their daughters. And these became real celebrities of their day. And perhaps the most famous was Indira Devi. Now, Indira Devi is the daughter of Sajirao Gaikwad, the person who turned his back on the king. Now, he was as we've heard, quite a liberal man, But he still wanted his daughter to marry a very important Maharaja. So she was lined up to marry the rather elderly Maharaja of Gwalior. But at the Delhi Durbar of 1911, while her father was misbehaving, she too was being chatted up by a very delightful young man who came from the state of Cooch Behar, which is a tiny, tiny kingdom in the Himalayas. And he wasn't even the crown prince, he was the number 2 son. And she fell in love and she eloped, much to the horror of her father, who didn't speak to her for years. Anyway, but her husband's older brother died, so she did in fact become the Maharani, the queen, but sadly her husband died. So she became the queen, the ruler, the regent, if you like. So she had a rather amazing life because she had quite a lot of power and she didn't necessarily have the restrictions that some of the women in India lived under. And Cooch Behar she came from that very liberal background, and Cooch Behar itself was rather liberal. So she dressed, sometimes dressed in a Western style. She had all the great couturiers make clothes for her, and she was this very, very famous person on the social circuit in Europe. Cole Porter wrote songs for her and everything. And she had a very, very beautiful daughter called Gayatri Devi, who married the Maharaja of Jodhpur, and Gayatri Devi was going to be a guest at our opening, our gala, and she died 3 months before the opening of Maharaja, and she's seen as the last of her kind, if you like, Gayatri Devi. It's very, very rare the Maharajas would marry Western women. Maharaja Kapurthala, I've mentioned a couple of times, his 5th wife was a dancing girl from Spain, of course a bit of a stir, but not his 1st wife, whereas the ruler of Pudukkottai, a very small state in southern India, he only had 1 wife, and she was from Australia. Molly Fink was her name. She was a nurse from Australia. And because she was neither Indian nor royal, nobody would recognise the marriage as being not legal, but they wouldn't allow the heir to inherit, if you like, neither the British nor the Indians. So the Raja abdicated in 1916 with a very handsome pension, and he moved his whole family to France, and they lived between Paris and London. And Molly spent much of her husband's pension on fabulous clothing, and who can blame her? And here she is wearing Cartier earrings and this wonderful coat by Madame Violet. It's a wonderful portrait by Cecil Beaton. And but Molly didn't always dress in a Western style. Here, this is her wonderful sari here that belonged to Molly Fink. And this one here belonged to Princess Nilufar of Hyderabad. Hyderabad, as I've mentioned a few times, you saw that amazing wedding costume right at the beginning. Very, very important state in India. It's quite hard to find objects that survive from Hyderabad, which is strange, but the Nizam was the richest man in the world. And he married his 2 sons to the 2 daughters of the last caliph of the Ottoman Empire, so uniting these 2 great Muslim families of the world. And Princess Nilufar was a very, very elegant woman, and her best friend was Sita Devi of Kapurthala, and these costumes belong to her. And again, this is one of my favourite photographs in the show, again by Cecil Beaton, very, very beautiful photograph. She was a gorgeous, gorgeous woman, and she only died in 2002, and her granddaughter has lent us these 2 sari. Now, all the way through the show, we've talked about patronage, so we're going to finish with perhaps one of the most avant-garde patrons of his day, Yaswantrao Holkar. Holkar, that name we've mentioned earlier, is from Indore. You remember that wonderful sword that was lost on the battlefield? Well, he was the Maharaja in the early 20th century, and he didn't show many signs of actually wanting to be the Maharaja, of taking on that responsibility, but he had to when he was quite young, and he was very, very much in love with his very, very beautiful wife. And you'll see these wonderful portraits behind by Man Ray, the avant-garde American photographer. Again, quite different from the photographs we've seen and the portraits we've seen so far, which have been very regal, very formal. This, I think, is just wonderful portrait of the young couple here. And he was very, very interested in the latest young designers of Europe. He was avant-garde by European standards, not just by British standards. And he had a number of homes around the world. He had a home in California, I believe, but he also had his famous home in Indore, which is called Manik Bagh, which was made for him by a man called Matusius. He was German, and it was kitted out in the latest kind of fashionable furniture of the day. This belonged to his wife, the lovely lady in the photographs. This wonderful dressing table set here, and her dressing table, and it's got these 2 holes here are for her curling irons to curl her hair. And he had this wonderful seat in his library. This is actually vinyl It's not leather, it's vinyl, which of course was a very new kind of substance of the day. Still got its lights working, which is wonderful to see. And he had his portrait, and he had this wonderful desk, I should mention, is by someone called Ruhlmann, who was one of the great furniture designers of his day. When my colleagues in the Western Furniture Department heard that we had a Ruhlmann desk in the exhibition, they were very, very surprised, but very excited. And he had his portrait painted. There are 2 portraits. We only have one in the show here, sadly. He had one painted in the style of his being a Maratha ruler, sitting on a gadi, and this one here in a consummate European gentleman in evening dress. And it doesn't really say anything about him being a Maharaja at all. It just talks about him being a stylish young man. But it really perhaps suggests of how difficult it was to kind of try and live in both worlds, perhaps not feeling comfortable in either. Now, what we see in this period, the last period of the exhibition, of course, is the rise of nationalism in India, and perhaps the marginalisation of the Maharajas. Acquiring wonderful, beautiful things was something that Maharajas had always done, but it rather confirmed a sort of stereotype left over from the Raj of them being rather frivolous, rather profligate, buying foreign things when Gandhi was emphasising that people should be buying domestic products and so on. And of course the nationalist movement led to independence in 1947, and most of India's kings willingly ceded their territories to the new state of India or Pakistan. The one who didn't was the Nizam of Hyderabad, and that was only taken by force. Hyderabad was bigger than France, so you can imagine that he wasn't prepared to become part of another country, but was forced to do so. But most of them gave up willingly, and they were able to preserve their status and their titles, but of course they didn't have their income anymore because they didn't have a state to tax or the natural resource of income. But they were given a privy purse, they were given like an allowance, a bit like the royal family in Britain have today. But this was all stripped from them in 1971 by Indira Gandhi, and overnight they became normal citizens. They had no income and had to pay enormous tax. And it was at this point that many of them had to sell off their treasures. They sold many of their palaces off, and they sold some of their treasures, and we suspect that's what's happened to some of the jewellery. It got broken up and sold in order that they could have an income. But the Maharajas have survived. They adjusted to life under the Mughals, they adjusted to life under the British, and of course they've adjusted happily to life in the new democracy that is India. Some of them have entered politics. The Maharaja of Gwalior is a very, very important politician in India. He always insists on being called Mr. Scindia, not the Maharaja of Gwalior. Many, as you know, have opened up their palaces for hotels, like I've mentioned in Jodhpur and in Udaipur, the famous Lake Palace Hotel. And many of them, of course, have opened up their palaces as museums to this day, so you can go and see some of his great treasures in India. And of course they remain, in many ways, the guardians of the spectacular culture of India's royal courts. Thank you. Carriage. Well, no, someone else asked me that. I don't know whether the Maharaja was particularly into dogs. They're not just bulldogs, they've got greyhounds resting, yeah. I don't know.
No particular reason.
There may well be it, but I don't know the answer to that. The owners of the carriage are very keen on doing a lot more research on the carriage. I mean, they've only acquired it recently, and in fact the dealer who bought it at a sale bought it because he likes Art Nouveau. They're dealers in Art Nouveau, they're not dealers in Indian objects. But so they're very much trying to sort of do research to see whether that reflected something about the Bhavnagar rulers, or was it something that interested the maker of the coach? We're not quite sure.
So we saw very few women, obviously.
Yes.
And did the women and the wives have beautiful jewelry
yes.
as well?
Yeah. So the women had quite an often important role at court. I mean, we tend to think of Muslim rulers as having many wives or whatever, but it was common in Hindu and Sikh courts as well. So polygamy was very common. Of course, people married for political reasons to make alliances. So the women's area of a court or a palace was very, very large. But lots of women were very, very important patrons themselves. They were often patrons of the arts, patrons of religion, patrons of music. And of course they also had the beautiful clothes and beautiful jewelry. And some of the jewelry in the palace life section would have been worn by women. Yeah.
How much does the bridal costume weigh?
Oh, I don't know. You might have to ask Kamar, because they had to all I can tell you is it took about 8 people, I believe, to slide the costume in. It's very, very heavy. Our poor conservators had a fit when I said, look, I found this fabulous thing. And they went, are you mad? So we had to practice many times in thinking about how we would support that beautiful sort of fine silk stole with that very, very heavy weight at the bottom. Kamar might have that information, because you may have given it to her to make sure the case was stable enough to take the mannequin. Yeah. Maharaja, which comes from the term Maharaj Daraj, which means king above kings. But although sometimes rulers would call each other that, they didn't often take on that word, if you like, until the 19th century. We've used it almost as a sort of generic term, if you like. But it's only Hindu rulers who are called Maharajas. And they're not always called Maharajas. Sometimes they're called Maharao. We saw Ram Singh in the procession and playing Holi. He's a Maharao. And the rulers of Mewar, we've met many of them as we've gone through the show, they're known by the unique title of Maharana. Yes, Maharana. Yes, that's right. Yes, which means great warrior. But Muslim rulers are known as Nawabs, like governors, if you like, apart from Hyderabad, which is a very special title which was given by the Mughal emperor, and he's the only one who's known as the Nizam.
Nizam, only one.
Only one. The ruler of Hyderabad is called the Nizam, yeah. And he's the only one with that title. Yeah.
How many independent princely states were there?
Well, that's a very hard question because there's it varied an awful lot. When we were thinking about the maps and the boundaries shifted all the time. At the time of the British, at the time of independence, there were about 600, but that's only because the British were constantly making people into Maharajas. So anybody who'd kind of, been nice to them and had a bit of land was given this title. So whereas, other, so it's hard to sort of say whether there was one moment where you could actually say there was the definitive number of rulers, but there were hundreds, yeah. But the Rajput ones are the ones that sort of have the longest heritage. And in Mewar particularly, they're very, very proud of, not only proud because they stood up to the Mughals and didn't kowtow to the British, but they trace their ancestry to 734, and it's the head of that family has been passed down to the son or the nephew. So it's a very continuous succession, and they're the oldest ruling dynasty in the world.
Wow. Thank you again.
Okay.